What's up, A to Z Sports Live? A little Doc Talk segment here. We got Dr. Ian Byron with us from the Bone and Joint Institute. 2 injuries, a 2-for-1 Doc Talk, because we all watched Monday Night Football. The Titans did get the first win of the season, but Will Levis out with a shoulder injury after playing only 11 snaps. And then Easton goes to the Titans locker room availability before the bye week on Tuesday. And then all of a sudden, Jeffery Simmons says he tore a ligament in his elbow. And so we had actually already set this up with Dr. Byram, who is the shoulder expert at the Bone and Joint Institute. And then right next to shoulder, it says and elbow. And so that's kind of perfect. So Dr. Byram, thanks for jumping on here. I'm glad we got you today to talk about both these guys.
Well, I appreciate you guys having me. And Easton, thanks for setting up that injury so I could talk about it. So keep going.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So that's the question, right? Are most guys also elbow guys, or are you just a 2-for-1 special?
So actually there is a fellowship training course called shoulder and elbow reconstruction. And so that's what I did my fellowship in, was actually shoulder, elbow, and sports medicine, believe it or not. So there's a certain segment of us that really do specialize in primarily upper extremity injuries, elbow up. So that's what I do. It's how I spend most of my hours of the day.
Cool.
Very good. Well, let's start with the Titans quarterback, because we know Brian Callahan has said now multiple times that when he's healthy, he's the Titans starting quarterback. But what we don't really know is what the severity is of this shoulder injury. We saw the play diving for the first down marker, landing on his throwing shoulder. He lip reading says, "I think I hurt my shoulder." Brian Callahan threw out the AC joint, said there was an MRI that was going to be had on Tuesday. We haven't heard any results of that, but reporting from the NFL Network saying that he should be okay for that Colts game after the bye week. So kind of take us through the very beginning of this. The AC joint, which joint is that? And then how does that impact the shoulder motion for a quarterback throwing the football?
Yeah. So there's some terminology that I think it's helpful to explain. When you hear about a shoulder dislocation, we're generally talking about the ball in the socket dislocating. Right up above that is where your collarbone meets the shoulder. And the AC stands for acromioclavicular joint. So it's where your collarbone meets where your shoulder blade wraps around. So when you have a shoulder separation, that means an injury to the AC joint. And there's really a lot of variability in that. So there's grades 1 to 6, and it can vary from a low grade 1, where you injure the ligament right up there on top, or it can be a grade 2 through 6, where you also injure the ligaments that help hold the collarbone down. And generally speaking, it's around grade 3 where it differentiates your treatment and recovery time. So if you have a low grade AC separation, that means that some of the ligaments are injured, some aren't, and you generally can have enough stability to be active sooner. If you have a high grade, that's when you see somebody coming off the field and their collarbones sticking up in a different direction and zip code. And those are the ones that either, if you treat it non-surgically, take a lot longer to stabilize, or we start talking about a surgery, which would then put him out, for the season.
So with most AC joint injuries, we talk about other joints on the body, the knee, the elbow, where an injury to one thing can sometimes mean structural damage to a couple of things. With an AC joint injury, is it typically just that AC joint that is of concern, or is it the shoulder more generally?
Yeah, great question. Typically, unfortunately, it is usually isolated to the AC joint. The mechanism by which it happens is typically falling directly on it. So we see this in football players, and especially even quarterbacks. They get blindsided, they land directly on that shoulder, and it's a compressive injury. Sometimes you'll see a coexisting labral tear, which is in the ball and socket joint. But generally speaking, this is going to be isolated to up above the ball and socket where the collarbone meets the shoulder. And that part of your shoulder doesn't have to rotate quite as much for a throwing motion. So it's certainly a little easier to get over an AC joint injury, especially if it's low grade, than something to do with your rotator cuff or your labrum or something that lives inside the ball and socket portion of the shoulder.
Yeah, if we go back to what Brian Callahan was saying in his interview before going in the locker room at halftime Monday night, he said, if he's healthy enough to go, we'll figure it out. We'll test it. We wanted Mason to get us to half so we can evaluate. He'll come back out there. he didn't go back out there, and we all saw the memes, the week 4 and 4 weeks of Will Levis memes of him grimacing on the sideline. Is that, I guess, with this injury, could it have gotten worse if he tried to fight through it and then gotten injured for a worsened injury, or would it just limited his throwing ability?
Well, a little bit of both. I mean, what you don't want to assume is that it's a simple low-grade AC separation, and then it turns out that on imaging there's a fracture. So, you know, with the same injury mechanism, you can actually fracture the end of your collarbone, and it can look and feel and act very similar. So that's why we typically want to get imaging before we just put somebody back on the field if they have an AC injury. That being said, once the imaging is done, if it proves that there's not a fracture and it's not a high-grade injury, this is something that as pain tolerance improves, we can often get people out on the field relatively quickly as compared to other types of injuries.
So is it just a pain tolerance thing? Does it impact your arm strength, your range of motion, or is it really just what you can tolerate?
Yeah, and I hesitate to say it's just a pain tolerance because that might make it sound like I'm somehow judging his toughness. And I think, we agree that he's willing to throw his body out there. Not judging your toughness, Will,
totally.
If you're listening. But sometimes the severity of the injury can cause not only pain, but weakness in that arm. So generally speaking, you want the athlete to be able to achieve full motion, getting their arm all the way above their head, and full strength before we get them on the field. Because if you can't get your arms above your head to catch a high snap, or you can't properly make the rotational move to accurately throw, then you're not really helping yourself or your team to be out there. So yes, pain tolerance, but you also get some motion through the AC joint when you're doing overhead activities. And again, that's position dependent.
Yeah.
If you're a wide receiver and you got to get your hands above your head, that's important. If you're a lineman and you're living most of your life down in here, it may not bother you as much, and you may be able to play even with a high-grade injury without a surgery.
Yeah, for a lineman, that might prevent holding. You don't want to get your hands outside. If your shoulder can't allow that to happen, maybe that's not a bad thing for a moment there. But no, all jokes aside, for Will Levis, we've got this bye week spot here. What are some things that you would expect a quarterback to be doing as far as some strength training and just rehab to try to get that feeling right to give himself the best chance to play against the Colts on October 6th?
Yeah. So
I'm sorry, October 13th. Bye week is the 6th. So give it a few more days.
Oh, thank goodness. All right. We got a whole nother week. That changes everything.
Yeah.
No, I think that rest is a big part of this. And then other modalities, ice, cryo, ways to get that swelling and inflammation down. There are times even that with certain injuries, and again, I'm not going to speak to his specifically, but you can try things like injections to try and calm down inflammation, or even some types of injections. You may have heard of things like PRP, which stimulate a healing response. Those are not usually, PRP is not usually an in-season kind of thing. It's if we're having trouble getting it to heal, but there are ways to try and get this inflammatory response down, and then gentle progressive strengthening to the point that he's able to make some of these motions that he needs to make. Again, this is all with the caveat I've not seen his imaging. I'm not treating his actual injury, but generally speaking, with respect to AC joint injuries, I've had a lot of football players and even quarterbacks come back to in-season play with an AC joint injury.
Well, the last question I have is, what is the re-aggravation risk with an AC joint injury? Is it something that you need to give proper time? We hear about these, especially soft tissue injuries, right? Just feeling better, but still having to be patient because if you get back out there, you're probably going to set yourself back. Is that something that you deal with an AC joint?
So I don't worry as much about a re-aggravation from throwing as much as I do of a re-injury. So if you take a second hit to that already somewhat tenuous joint and those ligaments are already a little bit unstable, then you run the risk of taking it from a low grade and making it a high grade. So that's where you really have to get muscle control back, motion back, so that you can adequately protect yourself. And we've seen this with a number of athletes. If you're trying to protect one thing, sometimes you're putting something else at risk. You've seen it with Tua. He had ankle surgery and then he dislocates his hip. you subconsciously alter how you are positioning your body on the field, how you're falling when you're tackled or when you're running the ball. So you want to get to a point where you're not favoring that so that you're not putting yourself at higher risk of re-injury.
Makes a ton of sense. Now we flip it over to Jeffery Simmons, who missed the game Monday with an elbow. He kind of popped up oddly on the injury report throughout last week before that Dolphins game, and then all of a sudden was doubtful to play, did not play. And then I guess it was Tuesday in the locker room after they returned from Miami, Jeffery Simmons told reporters that he actually tore a ligament in his elbow, and we'll let Big Jeff explain this.
Really friendly fire, of course, but I had, a little ligament that had tore my ligament in my sure everybody heard of the Tommy John with baseball players. I had that injury, and most of the time we don't really talk about it, but I mean I'm good now. We're going into a bye week, but like I say, it was one of them injuries that they thought it was just best for me to not go out there and put myself more at risk, knowing that I probably couldn't protect myself in a certain situation. But like I said, I'm ready to go for the coach. I know I'll be ready to go for the coach. Still got a little way to go with it. But
so there's Jeffery Simmons. He did clarify on Wednesday that he did not have the Tommy John surgery. He was just more talking about the ligament. So Dr. Byram, can I take us through what that injury sounds like from hearing Jeff talk about it himself?
Yeah, I also want to re-clarify. I would definitely never question Jeff Simmons' toughness. I want to get that out there on the airwaves.
You don't want to be Buck Rising 2.0.
No, thank you. No, thank you.
Yeah.
Good Jeff, we're on the same team here. So what he's talking about, your Tommy John's ligament is a name for the medial collateral ligament of your elbow. So much like your knee, which is also a hinge joint, you have a medial and a lateral collateral ligament. And so in a pitcher, which is how this got its name, Tommy John was a pitcher. If you have repetitive high velocity throwing, you can have a pop or an injury to that ligament. In a non-throwing athlete, we almost the majority of the time treat this non-surgically, and we allow this ligament to heal much like you would treat an MCL injury in a knee non-surgically. So the way we treat it is very similar. We brace it and we provide ways to give stability and external support for that ligament. And so we see a lot of football linemen wearing knee braces, even prophylactically. You'll see that for prevention of MCL or LCL injuries. Same concept. Oftentimes we can brace these types of injuries and get people back out on the field pretty quickly.
I think people are going to be enlightened to find out that you have an MCL in your elbow and in your knee, because you don't have an ACL in your elbow, right? That is
correct. So
is the UCL the equivalent of the ACL in the elbow?
So technically, yes, and it's actually called the medial ulnar collateral ligament. So it's the MUCL, and that's because the elbow and the shoulder are just more important joints than the knee. That's what my really likes.
Is that right?
We like to give fancier names, more
right. Accurate. I'm sure your knee friends over there at the Bone and Joint Institute would agree with you on that.
Yeah, I mean,
talk to Dr. Scott Arthur about this, and we'll see what he thinks.
Throwing athletes, but this is it is the analogous structure to the MCL in the knee, and the elbow is inherently a fairly stable joint. It's a really deep socket for the olecranon, so you can tear a ligament and not dislocate your knee. Your elbow, whereas in the knee, it requires those ligaments a little bit more.
So in a non-throwing athlete, when you see an MCL injury, is it a similar mechanism to what you often see an MCL injury in the knee, where it's a blow to the side? Is that what it typically is?
Yeah. So it's a blow to the side. A lot of times your elbow's extended, you're falling to the ground, you're catching yourself, and either you hyperextend or somebody hits your arm while it's locked out. In a Tommy John sense of the description, it's usually seen in a throwing athlete. They're reaching maximum external rotation. That puts a lot of torque across the elbow. So that's more of an attritional repetitive stress type injury. Whereas what I assume happened to Jeff was, more of a direct blow to the side, and then it puts stress on and gaps open that inside part, and you get a ligament injury.
Yeah, and he called it friendly fire. So he probably knows exactly what happened and when it happened and who did.
Oh, and he knows who it was. He just wouldn't tell us.
Yeah.
He said he was
not naming it though. But I mean, a sprain of a ligament, and this goes for the shoulder discussion as well. A sprain of a ligament can mean anything from a partial tear and stretch to a complete tear to a complete tear with dislocation or displacement. So there's a big gradient there. And, the more severe it is, the longer it takes to heal and recover. But it certainly was encouraging to hear his explanation of his elbow, because it sounds like one that hopefully we'll be able to brace and get him out there sooner rather than later.
And I get the stability aspect of what this injury does for Jeff is one thing. Like, what about his strength, right? Because he is in there fighting in the trenches against those O-linemen with using a lot of, I would guess, his like arm strength for positioning and hand fighting. How does that play a factor with the elbow injury?
Fortunately, ligaments, which is what he injured, that connects two bones. Tendons are the terminal extension of muscles. So if you have a biceps tendon tear, well, that's very much going to affect your elbow flexion strength. Right. Same thing with a triceps. So this ligament is not connected directly to a muscle. So he should, hopefully be able to demonstrate the same power that he normally has, as long as we can keep that joint stable, which is either through time and healing or bracing in the interim.
It makes a ton of sense. Easton, I've learned a lot. I mean, we learned a lot about the MCL with DeAndre Hopkins and how that can apply to Jeffery Simmons in a way.
Absolutely.
And then, so I guess you feel pretty good, Dr. Byram, about, knowing that you're not looking at the guy's imagings, but like neither of these feel like they are anything long-term that can't be taken care of, where these guys are going to be generally okay to play sooner rather than later.
With my typical caveat, not having seen their images, certainly Jeff's injury is one that is very commonly treated non-surgically, as he described, and his understanding of it sounded very high level. So I think, he seems to understand what's going on there. I think that the wild card with Levis's shoulder is, I just don't know what the severity of it is or what grade it is. So hopefully the initial reports of him potentially even going out in the same game is a sign that this was a low-grade injury, which could mean, that he'll get back out on the field. And that's, of course, what we're all hoping for him. So,
yeah, man, how many more of these DocTalks before I can get licensed to practice medicine? I feel like I'm close.
It's only seven DocTalks, and then you can do whatever you want.
News. I think I'm going to save a lot of money on med school.
This one might be 2, though. This was 2 for 1.
That's right.
But no, thanks as always. You guys are great. Love having our DocTalk segments. I know the audience does too. The Bone and Joint Institute, that's where you should turn whenever an injury happens in life, just like it does in football. These guys got you covered in Franklin. boneandjointtn.org. Dr. Byram, thanks again for the time. Good to see you, and appreciate the info.
Absolutely. Appreciate you guys having me on.